Moving on, now let's get to the first battle of the Civil War, the first technical battle after Fort Sumter. So each side tried to exploit its advantages. The South, by adopting a defensive strategy to wear down the North, led by the brilliant Robert E. Lee, and the North by using its superiority in manpower and technology. But the Northern Army was at first small, its officers and leadership were poor, and it was focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, a difficult task. Lincoln soon realized that capturing and occupying territory would not win the war. Defeating the South's armies would. Most of the war in the East occurred in a narrow corridor between Washington and Richmond, as a series of Union generals led the North's Army of the Potomac toward the Confederate capital, only to be repeatedly repulsed by the main Confederate army. The first significant clash at Bull Run ended in the defeat and chaotic retreat of Union forces, so the Confederacy won. This battle ended the widespread belief that the war would end quickly. George B. McClellan soon took command of the Union's main army, but after thoroughly training this army's tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers, he proved reluctant to commit them to battle. McClellan was a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, and he hoped that compromise might end the conflict without many casualties or weakening slavery. Pressured by public opinion, President Lincoln and Congress, McClellan, in the spring of 1862, led his army of more than 100,000 men into Virginia, so McClellan was pressured into it. Approaching the Confederate capital on the peninsula southwest of Richmond, McClellan's advance was ably deflected by Lee in a series of battles, forcing McClellan back to Washington, D.C. After Lee won the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, he invaded the North, hoping to bring border slave states into the Confederacy. He also hoped to gain French and British recognition of Southern independence, which was vital to the South. And he hoped to influence the North's elections in the fall and perhaps capture Washington, D.C. You also need to remember, as I said earlier, the Civil War was the first war in which metal submarines were used. So this war saw the famous battle, for example, between the Union vessel Monitor and the Confederate Merrimac in 1862, which showed the advantage of ironclads over wooden ships, and this really transformed naval warfare. At the Battle of Antietam, McClellan and the Army of the Potomac repelled Lee's invasion. In one day, and this is why this battle is significant, in one day at Antietam, nearly 4,000 men were killed and 18,000 wounded. More Americans died in this battle on this day, September 17, 1862, than any other day in American history, including Pearl Harbor and D-Day in World War II and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. To be sure, Northern triumph was short-lived. General Ambrose E. Burnside, who replaced McClellan, was repulsed by Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia in December 1862, with heavy losses. The North, to be sure, had better luck in the West. There, Ulysses S. Grant, a West Point graduate whose army career had been ruined by his excessive drinking, captured several important forts in Tennessee in early 1862. In April 1862, naval forces under Admiral David G. Farragut steamed into New Orleans and captured that city for the Union, which now controlled, and this is very important, the South's largest city and its lucrative nearby sugar plantations. After Grant repelled a surprise Confederate attack at Shiloh, Tennessee, Union success in the West then stalled. So again, the bloodiest single day of the war was September 17, 1862. 23,000 casualties. This is not to say this was the bloodiest battle in American history. This is the bloodiest single day in American history, the Battle of Antietam. Now, we also need to remember that the Civil War had revolutionary effects on American society, the most important of which was the destruction of slavery, the fundamental institution of Southern society. The emancipation of America's 4 million slaves, which technically happened after the war, in numbers, scale, and economic value, was far greater than any other emancipation of slaves or serfs in the world. At the war's beginning, and this is very important, Lincoln identified the North's cause with the cause of free labor. But Lincoln also initially stated that the conflict was not being fought to end or limit slavery, but rather to support the Union, preserve the Union. He wanted to keep the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri in the Union and build the broadest possible base of support for the war in the North. As Confederates used slave labor for military purposes, and blacks began to escape to Union lines, 1 million of them, 1 million slaves had run away. This initial policy of ignoring slavery became untenable. The runaway slaves did not allow Lincoln to ignore slavery. They forced the issue. So by the end of 1861, Union commanders had begun treating escaped slaves as, quote, contraband of war. They were technically property of military value, subject to confiscation. Southern blacks themselves took actions that propelled the Union toward ending slavery. That is, the 1 million of them that ran away to Union lines. Well before Lincoln's Emancipation Act in 1863, slaves saw the war as an opportunity to gain their freedom. Thousands escaped to the safety of Union lines, crippling many plantations. In areas occupied by Northern soldiers, slaves refused to work unless paid. Anti-slavery Northerners pressed the federal government to realize that slavery was the basis of the Southern economy and its military capacities, and they insisted emancipation was required in order to weaken the South. In other words, emancipation was now justified because it would be a military maneuver. The Constitution allowed the president to do whatever it took to win a war. And since the slaves were being used in the war effort, abolishing slavery in Confederate territories would thus be a war measure. So abolitionists and radical Republicans demanded, none more adamantly than Frederick Douglass, that abolition become a war aim. Congress, frustrated by military failures, prohibited the Army from returning fugitive slaves. They abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. and the territories, and they passed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves of disloyal owners in Union-occupied territory and slaves who escaped to Union lines. But Lincoln had reversed the policies of Union generals who declared emancipation in their districts, and he still endorsed colonization as a solution to slavery. So the first couple of years of the war, Lincoln was acting against emancipation. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln decided that emancipation had become a military and political necessity. He delayed his intention to free the slaves until a Union victory, and after the Battle of Antietam, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So it was Antietam, it was that military victory that prompted Abe, that gave him the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Also, he was assured by the four Upper South border states, slave states, that they would not leave the Union with this Emancipation Proclamation. They had already been making moves to emancipate their slaves. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document did not free all the slaves, and at first applied to very few. Based on Lincoln's authority as military commander-in-chief, the proclamation exempted areas under Union control. Thus, it did not apply to loyal border slave states that had not seceded or to parts of the Confederacy occupied by Union forces, such as Tennessee and parts of Virginia and Louisiana. But it declared free the vast majority of the South slaves, more than 3 million men, women, and children. Still behind Confederate lines, these slaves would be free only when Union military success made them so. Now, this is very important. Number one, this may not have technically ended slavery because it was a war measure and the war would eventually end. But Effectively, this does end slavery. You cannot go back on the Emancipation Proclamation because it also allowed free blacks and runaway slaves to join the Union military. And you cannot ask a man to pick up a rifle and then to put down the rifle and go back on the plantation. So the Emancipation Proclamation, again in 1863, made the Union Army an agent of freedom and promised the death of slavery by combining the goals of abolition and the Union. It altered the nature of the Civil War and the course of American history. It also represented a change in Lincoln's thinking. And this is huge. Lincoln no longer did he mention compensating slaveholders for the loss of their slaves. No longer did he mention colonization. He also began to think of partial suffrage for freed blacks. The order thus committed the North to enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army. It also was an explicit commitment to the abolition of slavery and African Americans staying here and becoming part of American society. And that is a watershed change in the thinking of Northerners and Republicans. Now, the Civil War, begun to preserve the nation, now promised a revolutionary transformation of Southern life and a redefinition of American freedom. Without colonization, emancipation meant incorporating freed slaves into American life. A new system of labor, politics, and race relations would have to replace slavery.